The colony of Erebos 9 was nothing like it had been in its glory days. Once a proud industrial world known across human space for its shipyards and factories, now it lay in ruins. The skies were a dull gray, streaked with smoke from burned-out refineries and scorched land where mines had collapsed decades ago. Rusted hulls of old warships drifted aimlessly in orbit, silent reminders of battles long past. The few humans who remained lived among scrap, scavenging whatever they could find to survive. The streets were lined with jagged pieces of metal, twisted machinery, and broken hovercars, all piled haphazardly as though the world itself had given up on order. Children ran barefoot across the dusty roads, their laughter faint and hollow against the constant hum of dying engines and the wind whistling through collapsed buildings. Hunger and fear were everyday companions, and yet, life stubbornly clung to the colony. In the middle of this wasteland lived Commander Rylan Holt, a man whose presence alone carried the weight of the past. Once celebrated in the Terran fleet for his brilliance as a naval engineer, he had seen his career destroyed in a scandal that he still could not fully explain. He had watched the collapse of human civilization up close, and each step toward the present had left him colder, more hardened. Erebos 9 was supposed to be his place of exile, a chance to disappear into obscurity. But the world had other plans. Rylan walked the streets every day, inspecting the skeletons of old buildings, the ruins of old factories, and the scattered remnants of battles, both past and recent. Everywhere he looked, he saw lost potential, broken dreams, and the quiet despair of people who had long stopped believing in a future. Rumors had begun circulating that the Core Dominion, a fearsome alien alliance that had conquered dozens of human colonies without mercy, was making its way toward Erebos 9. The people of the colony whispered in fear, talking of abductions, massacres, and enslavement. The authorities had long abandoned the planet, leaving civilians to fend for themselves. There was no help coming from the outer colonies, no fleet to defend them, no hope. Rylan knew it in his bones. Humanity's survival depended on themselves alone. He had tried to rally the other engineers and former officers to prepare for defense, but fear had already paralyzed them. "We're only scraps," they said. "We're nothing. What can we possibly do?" The words echoed in Rylan's mind, gnawing at him, stirring a fire he thought had died long ago. One night, after wandering the scrapyards in silence, Rylan found himself in what used to be a shipyard before the collapse. It was a graveyard of forgotten technology, filled with the rusted remains of starships, half-demolished hulls, and discarded engines. Among them lay the skeleton of a warship, partially buried in the dust, broken and bent as if it had been crushed by the weight of despair itself. Its metal was scratched, scarred, and corroded, but there was something about it that spoke to Rylan, a memory of glory, a whisper of what humans once were capable of. He ran his hands over the cold steel, imagining the engines roaring back to life, the weapon systems firing across the void, the ship soaring through the stars once again. He could almost hear the hum of its power core, the hiss of plasma through its conduits, the command deck alive with officers and crew. That night, he could not sleep. He sat alone atop the hull, staring at the broken city below and the darkened skies above. He thought of the children scavenging for scraps, of families huddled in makeshift shelters, and of the countless lives that would be destroyed if the Dominion arrived. He thought of himself, a man who had spent decades avoiding responsibility, hiding from the failures of his past. And then, for the first time in years, a spark ignited within him. It was a thought so radical it almost frightened him. If no one was going to save humanity, then maybe it was time to stop waiting. Maybe it was time to take what they had, the scrap, the broken machines, the discarded pieces of a forgotten fleet, and make something that could fight back, something that could protect them, something that could restore hope. The idea seemed impossible at first. How could a group of survivors with nothing but scraps build a weapon capable of facing the Dominion? Rylan knew it would be madness to even try, but as he looked at the ruins around him, he realized that the impossible was all they had left. They had no fleets, no governments, no allies. They had only each other, their hands, their minds, and the wreckage of a lost civilization. And perhaps that was enough. He imagined gathering the colony's engineers, mechanics, and even the children who had learned to fix broken machines in the streets, and together, building something that had never existed before. A warship, born not from luxury or design perfection but from survival, creativity, and sheer human determination. Rylan spent the next days walking the streets of Erebos 9, talking to whoever would listen. Many were skeptical. "We're just scraps," they said. "We can't fight them." But he persisted, showing them parts of the wrecked hulls and engines, pointing to pieces of abandoned starships that could be combined into something new. Slowly, curiosity replaced doubt. Engineers and mechanics began to talk quietly among themselves, trading ideas about how engines could be repurposed, how armor could be reinforced, and how weapons could be scavenged from old battlefields. Children offered to help, scavenging for rare metals and circuitry that might have otherwise been lost. It was the first time in years that people had dared to dream together. Even at night, Rylan could not stop thinking about it. He would walk, alone, to the hull of the half-buried warship, tracing the lines of the frame with his fingers, imagining the decks filled with crew, the corridors echoing with life, the guns firing at enemies who thought humans were weak. He could picture it soaring into the black of space, a beacon of defiance in a galaxy that had long forgotten their name. The thought gave him a strange warmth, a sense of purpose he had not felt in decades. And with it, he made a vow. If humanity was going to survive, they would do it themselves. They would build a protector from the ashes, a ship that could inspire courage in the hopeless and fear in the hearts of the Dominion. That night, under the dim light of a blood-red sunset, Rylan made the first sketches of what would later become Project Revenant. He drew rough lines on scraps of metal and torn paper, not worrying about precision. He wrote down ideas for engines, shields, and weapon systems, imagining how each part could be salvaged and repurposed. To an outsider, it would have looked like nonsense, but to Rylan, it was hope. A blueprint for a future that humanity had almost forgotten existed. The colony was dying, but from its ruins, a plan was being born. A plan that would take desperation and turn it into defiance, fear into courage, and scrap metal into the most feared warship the galaxy had ever seen. And as the night deepened, Rylan stood alone on the hull, staring up at the distant stars. He whispered to himself, a quiet promise against the silence of the universe. If no one else will save us, we will save ourselves. And for the first time in decades, he felt a flicker of hope. Rylan Holt knew that hope alone could not build a warship. Dreams were useless without hands to turn them into reality, so he began seeking people who still had the spark of life left in them, people who refused to be crushed by despair, no matter how deep the ruins went. It was not an easy task. Most of the colony's survivors had given up. They scavenged for scraps, worked for little pay, and often spent nights drinking or gambling to escape the reality of their lives. But Rylan was persistent. He visited broken workshops, abandoned factories, and even the shadowy corners where scavengers bartered pieces of scrap, showing them pieces of metal that could be transformed, engines that could roar again, and weapons that could fire. Slowly, curiosity began to replace their hopelessness. Among the first to join him was Dr. Lyra Vance, a brilliant scientist who had once worked on advanced starship engines for the Terran fleet. She had lost faith in humanity when the fleet collapsed and the colonies were left to rot. Now she lived among the wreckage, using her genius to create small gadgets and engines for people willing to trade food or fuel. When Rylan approached her with his idea of building a warship from scrap, she laughed at first. "You're insane," she said. "A warship from scrap? You'd be lucky to make it hover 5 feet off the ground." But Rylan's eyes were not pleading. They were filled with determination, fire, and a vision she had not seen in decades. Something about him made her stop laughing. That night she could not sleep, thinking about the possibilities. By morning she had agreed to help. Rylan's next recruits were mechanics, miners, ex-pilots, and even some of the older children who had learned to repair hovercars and mining equipment while their parents struggled to survive. Together, they became a small army of builders, dreamers, and scavengers united by one purpose: to turn nothing into something that could protect them all. They worked in the sprawling scrapyards, surrounded by rust, dust, and the remains of the once great fleet. Every piece of metal was examined, every broken engine studied, every wire and circuit tested and repurposed. Nights were long and the work was exhausting. Sparks flew as welders joined scraps together, and the smell of burning metal filled the air. Some nights, the workers argued, frustration bubbling over as a crucial piece broke or a design failed. But Rylan and Lyra reminded them why they were doing this. It was not just a warship. They were building hope. The project quickly earned a name among the colony: Project Revenant, named for the idea of rising from death, of returning stronger than before. The name inspired people more than any speech could. Children would run through the scrapyards, collecting small pieces of metal, nuts, and bolts, eager to contribute. Even the elders who had long given up on the world came to watch, offering advice, telling stories of the old fleet, and sharing knowledge that had been nearly lost. The energy in the colony began to shift. People who once wandered aimlessly now had purpose. They were no longer scavengers of the past, they were builders of the future. The technical challenges were enormous. The engines they found were decades old and partially destroyed. The weapon systems had been stripped from ships that were themselves only scraps. Shielding technology was incomplete, with no one alive who truly understood how it had worked. Yet Rylan and Lyra approached each problem with creativity rather than despair. Old mining drills were converted into plasma accelerators. Rusted armor plates were reforged and layered to create a hull capable of withstanding extreme firepower. Discarded starfighter components were merged to form navigation systems, and old drone AIs were reprogrammed to assist in targeting and ship operations. Every system was improvised, yet each solution brought the team closer to completion. Despite the challenges, the colony grew closer. Long hours in the scrapyard turned into camaraderie. Meals were shared over plans and blueprints spread across dusty tables. Stories were told of old battles, lost colonies, and the glories of humanity's past. People laughed together, argued, and sometimes cried. The project became more than just building a ship. It became the heartbeat of Erebos 9. Children who had never seen a fully functioning starship learned how engines worked, how metal could be bent and shaped, and how circuits could be rerouted to make something function. They were learning skills that could save lives, and more importantly, they were learning that humans could still achieve the impossible. As weeks turned into months, the Revenant began to take shape. At first, it was only a skeletal frame of twisted metal, towering above the scrapyards like a monument to hope. Then engines were attached, cannons welded into place, and control systems installed. The team was exhausted, but every time they looked at the growing structure, they saw proof that they were doing something real. Slowly, a broken world began to feel alive again. Even the skies seemed different. Where once there was only gray, now there were occasional streaks of light from the exhaust of engines being tested or sparks from welding. It was as if the universe was beginning to respond to their effort, recognizing that humanity had not yet been defeated. There were moments of doubt. A particularly severe storm once tore through the scrapyard, bending metal, flooding work areas, and damaging engines that had taken weeks to restore. Supplies ran low, arguments grew fierce, and some workers left, claiming it was impossible to succeed. Rylan refused to let despair take hold. He worked side by side with the builders, repairing engines, welding plates, and encouraging them to continue. Lyra developed new designs to protect the ship from further storms, and together they instilled a sense of resilience in the crew. Every failure became a lesson, every setback a step forward. Slowly, the naysayers returned, inspired by the determination of those who refused to quit. By the end of this phase, the Revenant was no longer just a pile of scrap metal. It was a vessel with purpose. Its hull was reinforced, its engines functional, and its rudimentary weapons ready. The team had learned to work together, to trust each other, and to believe in a vision that had seemed impossible. And though the Dominion fleet still loomed somewhere in the darkness of space, the people of Erebos 9 no longer felt helpless. They had created something from nothing, something that symbolized not just survival, but defiance. Rylan and Lyra stood on a platform overlooking the ship for the first time, their eyes tracing the lines of the massive structure. It was far from complete, far from perfect, but it was alive. Sparks of light danced across its hull. The engines hummed faintly, and the cannons, though crude, promised firepower beyond what anyone had imagined possible. The team below cheered, wiping soot from their faces, tired but filled with a sense of accomplishment that no food or reward could replace. This was not just a ship, it was a statement. Humanity was not dead. Humanity could rise, and from the scrap of a forgotten world, they were building a force that could one day shake the galaxy. In the nights that followed, Rylan would often walk around the ship, imagining what it would be like when it was finished, imagining how it would feel to take it into space, to face enemies who had thought humans were weak, and to show that determination, creativity, and unity could overcome even the most insurmountable odds. The Revenant was becoming more than metal and engines, it was becoming a symbol of what humans could achieve when they refused to give up, when they worked together, and when they dared to dream of greatness, even in the darkest of times. The Revenant was no longer just an idea, it was becoming real, standing tall in the scrapyards of Erebos 9. Its skeletal frame had begun to fill out with engines, armor, and weapons, and the people of the colony were filled with a sense of pride they hadn't felt in years. But with progress came danger. Word of the project had spread across human space, reaching ears that did not wish humanity to rise again. Smugglers, pirates, and spies began to appear near the colony, offering strange deals or watching from the shadows. Rumors spread of Dominion agents infiltrating Erebos 9, trying to sabotage what they had once thought of as a weak, helpless world. It began slowly, with small things. Tools went missing. Engines that had been carefully repaired suddenly failed, and strange malfunctions appeared in the newly installed weapon systems. At first, the workers thought it was human error, fatigue, or the unpredictability of old equipment. But then came the night when the explosion tore through part of the shipyard. The ground shook violently, throwing debris into the air. Sparks flew as flames engulfed piles of scrap and twisted metal. Dozens of people were injured. Some were trapped beneath fallen beams. The colony erupted in panic, and in the chaos, Rylan was badly hurt. His arm badly burned and his leg bruised. He had barely escaped the collapse, crawling from the wreckage while coughing smoke and dust. Lyra Vance took command immediately. She moved among the injured, directing survivors to safety, while keeping an eye on the damage to the Revenant. Her hands were blackened with soot, her face streaked with dirt and sweat, but her mind remained sharp. She assessed the damage quickly. Entire sections of the ship's frame had been twisted or destroyed. Several weapons were gone, and key components of the engines had melted. She realized that if they didn't act fast, the dream could die before it even left the scrapyard. But Lyra refused to let that happen. "We rebuild," she told the shaken workers, her voice firm and unyielding. "We rebuild stronger. Nothing destroys this ship except us turning our backs, and that won't happen." The survivors began working through the night. Despite exhaustion, burns, and bruises, they picked up tools and started repairing the damage. Broken beams were reforged and welded back into place. Engines were reassembled, circuits rerouted, and weapon systems recalibrated. Lyra personally oversaw the work, moving between teams, giving advice, adjusting designs, and inspiring confidence. She had once believed that humans were too weak, too disorganized to rebuild from ruin. Now she realized how wrong she had been. This crew, these people, were more than survivors. They were a family, a team, and together they could achieve what no one else thought possible. The sabotage had been intentional, and the fear of another attack lingered. Rylan, though injured, insisted on being present for the rebuilding. He walked carefully through the scrapyard, inspecting each repair, encouraging workers, and teaching techniques to reinforce the ship against future damage. His presence reminded the people why they were building the Revenant, why every sleepless night and every blistered hand mattered. Slowly, the workers' morale returned. The sabotage, instead of crushing them, became a rallying point. It reminded them that they were building not just a ship, but a symbol of resistance against those who thought humanity was finished. As the weeks passed, the Revenant grew stronger. Sections that had been destroyed in the explosion were now reinforced with double plating. Engines were upgraded with scavenged parts, and new weapon systems were installed in innovative ways. Lyra introduced clever modifications, turning old mining lasers into rapid-fire cannons and adapting drone targeting systems to compensate for the colony's lack of trained pilots. Every improvement made the ship more formidable, more alive, more unstoppable. The people worked tirelessly, refusing to be beaten by fear or despair. They knew that the Dominion fleet would eventually arrive, and that when it did, There would be no second chance. But the psychological toll of constant danger weighed heavily on the colony. Nights were sleepless as lookouts kept watch for Dominion scouts. Children hid beneath debris while adults patrolled, fearing that spies could strike again at any moment. Arguments broke out over the smallest details: how to allocate resources, which systems to prioritize, or how to repair damaged sections. Tensions ran high, and yet, through every argument and disagreement, Rylan and Lyra mediated, reminded everyone of their shared purpose, and ensured that no one lost sight of the dream. Slowly, the team learned to trust each other, to rely on their collective skill rather than fear, and to find strength in unity. The Revenant itself became more than metal. It became a living entity in the eyes of the colony. Every weld, every engine, every cannon reflected their struggle, their perseverance, and their hope. They could feel it, hear it, and sometimes even speak to it as they worked. "We will make you stronger," a young mechanic would whisper while tightening a bolt. "You will protect us." It was a strange, almost spiritual connection born from months of sweat, labor, and fear. The ship was no longer just a tool. It was a symbol of humanity's determination to rise from the ashes of their own collapse. One evening, as Rylan and Lyra watched the workers restore the damaged sections, the sky turned a deep red. Smoke from burning scrap mixed with the setting sun, casting an eerie glow over the scrapyard. For the first time, Rylan allowed himself to imagine what the completed Revenant would look like in space. He pictured it soaring past the colony's atmosphere, its engines glowing, weapons ready, shields humming, and crew prepared to face the Dominion fleet. He imagined the awe and fear it would inspire in those who had once thought humans were weak. The thought filled him with renewed determination. They were not just fighting for survival, they were fighting to reclaim their identity, their pride, and their place in the galaxy. The rebuilding took longer than anyone had expected. Days bled into nights and weeks into months. Supplies ran low, yet scavenging teams returned with rare metals, fuel cells, and parts from derelict ships. The crew learned to improvise constantly, combining incompatible systems and making them work. A mining drill became a turret, a burned-out reactor became a temporary power core, and broken sensors were adapted for navigation. Every success, no matter how small, became a victory that fueled their morale. Every failure became a lesson. By the time the repairs were complete, the Revenant was stronger, smarter, and more dangerous than before. The Dominion fleet was still out there, approaching silently, and the colony could feel the tension in the air. Every member of the team knew that they were preparing for a confrontation that might be their last. But instead of fear, the sabotage had ignited a fire within them. They had faced destruction, survived, and emerged stronger. The Revenant was no longer just a dream. It was a weapon, a fortress, and a promise. And as Rylan looked at the ship, at the workers, at Lyra standing beside him with soot on her face and determination in her eyes, he realized that they were ready. The Dominion might think humans were weak, disorganized, and defeated, but they had underestimated the power of unity, determination, and imagination. When the last section was welded in place, when the engines were tested and the weapons calibrated, a cheer went up across the scrapyard. It was not just joy, it was relief, pride, and defiance all at once. The people of Arevos 9 had survived sabotage, injuries, and fear, and they had built something extraordinary from nothing. For the first time in years, the colony felt alive. The Revenant stood tall, ready for the stars, ready for battle, and ready to prove that humanity could rise from even the deepest ruins. And though the night was quiet, and the stars hung silently above, Rylan and Lyra knew that this was only the beginning. The Dominion fleet was coming. The true test of everything they had built was near. But for now, in the glow of the rebuilt ship, surrounded by a team that refused to quit, they allowed themselves a moment of triumph. They had turned disaster into determination, fear into courage, and wreckage into a weapon that would one day shake the galaxy. The day had finally come. Months of endless labor, sweat, and fear had led to this moment. The Revenant, the ship born from scrap, ingenuity, and human determination, stood in the scrapyard of Arevos 9 like a massive, defiant sentinel. Its engines glimmered faintly with the first test power, the armor plates reinforced, and the weapon systems loaded with whatever ammunition they had managed to scavenge. Every weld, every pipe, every panel told the story of the colony's struggle, of the lives lost and the nights spent working under dim lights while dust and sparks filled the air. Now the question remained. Could it survive the trial of fire waiting beyond the planet's atmosphere? The first sign of danger appeared on the horizon as scouts detected the Dominion fleet approaching. Ships of varying sizes cut through the dark void of space, their shapes cold and terrifying, moving with the precision of centuries of conquest. The colony shivered at the sight. Parents gathered their children in whatever shelters they could find. Workers paused, wiping soot from their faces and trembling in anticipation. Rylan Holt, despite his lingering injuries, stood tall, his eyes locked on the fleet. He knew that hesitation now could cost them everything. Lyra Vance, beside him, checked the last systems, her hands steady, her face a mask of concentration. "This is it," she said quietly. "Either we rise or we fall. But we fight." The launch preparations were frantic. Some engines were still unstable. The hull had minor weak points and the weapons systems were far from perfect. The ship groaned as the crew ran final checks, and a cloud of dust and smoke swirled around the scrapyard as the engines powered up. Sparks flew, metal twisted under stress, and for a moment it seemed the Revenant might collapse under its own weight. But the combined skill of the colony's builders held it together. Pilots clambered into their cockpits, technicians readied the targeting systems, and the crew took their positions. For months they had trained and improvised, and now the final test awaited them. When the main thrusters ignited, the ground shook violently. Dust and debris erupted into the sky as the Revenant's engines roared to life. A sound like thunder and fire filled the air, drowning out everything else. The ship lifted slowly at first, then surged upward with a force that made the entire scrapyard quake. Workers and onlookers cheered from below, their voices small against the enormity of what was happening, yet filled with joy and relief. The ship, once considered impossible, was alive. Its engines hissed and roared, propelling it higher, its hull reflecting the red-orange glow of the sun. The sound of metal bending and grinding under power was terrifying, but it was also a symphony of triumph. As the Revenant cleared the atmosphere, it faced the full view of the Dominion fleet. Hundreds of enemy ships spread across space like a black tide, their weapons ready, their pilots experienced killers trained to destroy any human opposition. For a moment, fear gripped the crew. The odds were overwhelming. The Dominion had thought humans weak, disorganized, and scattered. But the sight of the Revenant, powered by ingenuity and will, caused hesitation, even among their ranks. The ship moved forward, engines glowing, weapon systems online. Every eye aboard the ship and below on the planet watched as the impossible faced reality. The first volley came swiftly. Lasers and missiles streaked toward the Revenant, some striking its armor, others missing by inches. Sparks flew as shields absorbed what they could, and the reinforced hull groaned under pressure. The crew reacted with precision, returning fire with the scavenged weapons that had been converted, adapted, and improved. Old mining drills now functioned as rail cannons. Railguns salvaged from derelict ships sent powerful magnetic projectiles toward the fleet. The first Dominion cruiser in their path disintegrated in a burst of fire and metal, leaving debris scattering across the void. The crew of the Revenant cheered, but there was no time to celebrate. The battle had only just begun. The ship moved like a living creature, its engines adjusting to every maneuver, shields flaring in response to impacts, and weapon systems tracking multiple targets simultaneously. Lyra's programming of the AI targeting system proved invaluable, predicting enemy maneuvers and adjusting firing sequences in real time. Pilots who had trained on simulators now found themselves in the cockpit of a ship they had helped build, executing evasive maneuvers that seemed impossible. The Dominion fleet was ruthless, but the Revenant was relentless. Every shot that landed on the enemy ships demonstrated the ingenuity of its creators, a testament to human determination in the face of impossible odds. Back on Erebos 9, the people watched with awe. Fires from destroyed enemy ships lit up the atmosphere, and explosions shook the colony even from orbit. Children and adults alike cheered for the ship they had built, feeling as if each victory in space was a victory for themselves. The realization struck them. The Revenant was not just defending them, it was proving that humans were capable of more than survival. They were capable of greatness. For the first time in decades, the people of Erebos 9 dared to hope that they could change their destiny. Hours passed, though it felt like minutes. The Dominion fleet continued its assault, but the Revenant held firm. Its reinforced armor absorbed the worst of the attacks, while its weapons tore through the enemy ranks. The combination of human ingenuity, salvaged technology, and sheer courage allowed the ship to fight above its weight. Each crew member acted with precision, knowing that the fate of the colony and perhaps all of humanity rested on their shoulders. Rylan moved among the crew, offering guidance and encouragement, his presence steadying those who felt fear. Lyra monitored every system, adjusting, recalibrating, and improvising to keep the ship in the fight. By the end of the battle, the Revenant had destroyed or driven off the majority of the Dominion fleet. Smoke and debris floated in space, marking the remnants of a force that had once seemed invincible. The ship, though battered and scarred, remained standing, its engines still glowing, its weapons ready, its crew exhilarated. Victory had been achieved not through perfect technology or overwhelming numbers, but through creativity, courage, and the refusal to give up. The people of Erebos 9 realized that they had witnessed something extraordinary. A ship built from scrap, powered by determination, had faced a fleet and survived. Rylan and Lyra stood on the command deck, looking at the stars littered with enemy debris. "We did it," Rylan said quietly, his voice filled with pride. "We really did it." Lyra smiled, her face streaked with soot and sweat. "It's only the beginning," she said. "The galaxy will hear about this. They'll know that humans are not weak and that we will fight for ourselves." Below them, the colony erupted in celebration, fireworks of joy and relief echoing in the skies. The Revenant had proven its worth, but more importantly, it had proven the strength of humanity when it refused to surrender. As the ship prepared for its next course into space, the crew felt a renewed sense of purpose. They had not just built a warship, they had built hope, courage, and a symbol that could inspire countless others across the galaxy. The Revenant had risen from the ruins of Erebos 9, forged from scrap and determination, and it would continue to rise no matter the odds. Because it represented something far greater than metal and engines. It represented humanity itself. The battle had ended, but the galaxy would never be the same. The Revenant, forged from scrap metal, determination, and human ingenuity, floated amidst the debris of the Dominion fleet. Its hull was scarred, its engines smoking from the strain of combat and its weapon systems partially depleted. Yet it stood proud, a testament to everything the people of Erebos 9 had fought for. On board, the crew was exhausted but exhilarated. They had faced a force that had once seemed unstoppable, and they had survived. Not only that, they had won. The Dominion had underestimated humans, and that miscalculation had cost them dearly. Rylan Holt stood on the command deck, watching the stars dotted with the wreckage of enemy ships. For months he had dreamed of this moment, but even in victory he felt the weight of the losses. Friends and workers had died in accidents, sabotage, and skirmishes. Children had nearly been caught in the chaos of the attack. The triumph was bittersweet, but the knowledge that humanity had survived and had fought back made the pain bearable. He turned to Lyra Vance, whose face was still smeared with soot and sweat. "We did it," he whispered, though his voice carried more awe than relief. "We actually did it." She nodded, a tired but proud smile spreading across her face. "It's more than just a ship," she said. "It's proof that we can rise from nothing." The crew began assessing the damage to the Revenant, repairing systems where possible, and securing the ship for travel. Even in the aftermath of battle, the lessons learned during its construction proved invaluable. Improvisation, ingenuity, and teamwork had saved them during combat, and now those same skills were keeping the ship alive. Engineers patched damaged armor, recalibrated weapons, and stabilized the engines, turning the Revenant from a battered warship into a functioning vessel capable of continuing its mission. Every bolt tightened, every system tested, every spark of repaired wiring reminded them that they had achieved something extraordinary. News of the victory spread quickly across the galaxy. Worlds that had once mocked humanity's weakness now spoke in hushed tones of the Revenant. Colonies that had thought they were abandoned and helpless felt a new surge of hope. Traders, explorers, and refugees told tales of the ship that had risen from a scrapyard, of humans who had defied impossible odds, and of a fleet destroyed by a force they had considered powerless. Fear and respect followed the name Revenant wherever it was mentioned, and for the first time in decades, humanity was seen not as weak or doomed, but as resilient, clever, and dangerous. Back on Erebos 9, the people celebrated, Children ran through the streets, their laughter ringing louder than it had in years. Survivors embraced, crying tears of relief and pride. Every scrap of metal that had been repurposed, every sleepless night, every drop of sweat and blood was now part of a story larger than anyone had imagined. Rylan walked through the colony, shaking hands, hugging workers, and quietly acknowledging the sacrifices made to build the ship. People looked at him not as a former commander or a disgraced officer, but as a symbol of determination, a leader who had reminded them that even in the darkest times, humans could create something incredible. Lyra moved through the workshops, speaking with engineers, mechanics, and children who had helped collect parts and build systems. She explained how their work had saved lives, how their improvisations had made the ship stronger than anyone had expected, and how their courage had ensured humanity would be remembered. The young ones listened in awe, imagining themselves as part of a crew that had faced the galaxy's greatest threat and emerged victorious. It was a lesson that could never be taught in classrooms or lectures, one that had been earned in fire, sweat, and fear. The Revenant itself became a symbol beyond Erebos 9. It represented the potential of humanity to rise from ruin, to innovate when all seemed lost, and to fight with courage even against overwhelming odds. Pilots and crew began training new recruits, passing on the knowledge of how a ship built from scrap could outmaneuver fleets designed for perfection. Engineers studied every modification, every clever solution, every patch that had kept the ship alive, preparing the way for future vessels that could protect humanity. The ship had not only survived battle, it had inspired a new generation of humans to believe in themselves. Rylan and Lyra spent long hours in quiet reflection aboard the Revenant, looking out at the stars. They understood that this victory was only the beginning. The galaxy was vast and threats remained. Other powers would hear of the Revenant and plot against humanity, thinking that the destruction of one ship would remove the threat. They underestimated the spirit that had built it. For humans, the Revenant was more than a warship. It was a beacon, a challenge, a reminder that ingenuity, courage, and unity could turn the impossible into reality. As repairs continued and supplies were replenished, the crew prepared for future missions. They trained in combat navigation and teamwork, ensuring that the ship was ready to defend humanity wherever needed. Yet despite the preparations, there was a sense of wonder that remained. Every movement of the ship reminded them of the impossible task they had accomplished. Every system that worked perfectly under stress was a tribute to the hundreds of hands that had built it, the ingenuity of people who refused to give up, and the sacrifices that had made it possible. The people of Erebos 9 came to view the Revenant not as a tool, but as a protector, a living symbol of resilience. Children drew pictures of it, storytellers recounted its battles, and the colony held ceremonies to honor those who had died during its construction. Even those who had once doubted the project now understood that the ship represented the best of humanity, the ability to create, adapt, and rise against any obstacle. The Revenant had become legend, even before it traveled beyond the colony, and its story would echo across worlds for generations. Rylan often walked along the ship's deck, reflecting on how far they had come. From a scrapyard filled with rusted metal and broken engines to a warship capable of defeating fleets, it had been a journey of hope, fear, and determination. He thought of the moments when all seemed lost, the sabotage, the injuries, the nights spent repairing systems under danger, and realized that those moments had forged something far stronger than metal. They had forged spirit, unity, and courage. The ship was a testament to human resilience, and its story would inspire all who heard it. As the sun set over Erebos 9, casting long shadows across the scrapyard and illuminating the repaired hull of the Revenant, Rylan and Lyra stood together on the command deck. They watched the stars slowly fill the sky, each point of light a reminder of the vastness of the galaxy and the challenges that still lay ahead. Yet in that moment there was no fear, only pride, only hope, only the knowledge that humanity had taken its first real step toward reclaiming its place among the stars. The Revenant, built from nothing but scraps and human determination, would continue to sail the galaxy, defending humanity, inspiring hope, and proving that even the weakest among us can achieve greatness when we refuse to surrender. It was more than a warship. It was a symbol, a legend, and a promise that humanity, no matter how broken, could rise, fight, and triumph. And from the scrapyards of Arivos 9, that promise had been fulfilled.